I'm Gene Hamm, and I'd like to read you another chapter, another little excerpt from my book, How to Get a Job in Animation and Keep It. This is my third trip to Hollywood. In 1978, my wife informed me at our dinner table that she was divorcing me for another man. My whole world caved in. A year before, my father had died, and now I was losing my wife. Everything in my past that I had counted on just suddenly evaporated. Then a renewed hope coursed through my veins. If everything I had ever depended on was gone, I had nothing to lose. I could do something about my future. I would take another crack at Hollywood. I dialed a friend of mine in Los Angeles, Frank Morris, and I met him in 1973 when he won Best Animated Short Oscar for Frank Film, a autobiographical rapid-fire collage film. He had been scheduled to speak and show films at the Northwest Film Study Center in Portland before the Oscars. When I saw him win the Oscar, I decided to see his films. I was so impressed with his unique vision of animation that I asked him for his address in New York so I could write him. During his speech, he mentioned that his film required boxes of magazine cutouts that stacked to the ceiling. On my way to work every day, I would pass a station wagon filled with refuse. It was stuffed from the back to the front passenger seat and across the dashboard. There was just a small space left fairly trash-free for the driver. On one of my trips to work, I took photographs of this car from various angles and sent them to Frank with a letter that opened, "I've seen Frank's film. Is this Frank's car?" He thought that was funny, and we've been pen pals ever since, and now Facebook friends. I told Frank and his wife Caroline of my divorce and asked if I could stay with them for a little while uh, until I found a job in an apartment down in Los Angeles. They had moved to Los Angeles since then. They were such wonderful friends that they readily agreed. My wife was also kind enough to divorce me in summer um, when the animation season was open. And I had been reading in the ads at the back of American Cinematographer for months that Ralph Bakshi was animating Lord of the Rings and was looking for animators. I figured by the time I moved to LA all the jobs would be filled, but I had to give it a shot. When I arrived at Frank and Caroline's house, they were in the middle of working on two films. The first was Coney, which is all done with hand-colored photocopies. They had shot a live-action black and white movie of a carousel on Coney Island, run the film through a microfiche machine, and photocopied each frame of film onto an 8 by 10 sheet of paper, which was then hand-colored with felt markers. The second was Impasse, which they made by moving address and inventory labels uh, to geometrical patterns across the screen. For my room and board, I helped them color the photocopies for Coney. The first week I was there, I made an appointment to see Harry Love at Hanna-Barbera. He had been the effects animator on Chuck Jones' Roadrunner cartoons. He looked at my portfolio, and again I was turned down for an animator's position at Hanna-Barbera. But he said my stuff wasn't all that bad, and he could put me in a Hanna-Barbera training program that he ran. So one evening a week, I went down to Hanna-Barbera and got trained by rotating cartoonists and animators. The second week I was in Los Angeles, I called Ralph Bakshi Studios and asked for personnel. Now they call that position human resources. The lady on the other end of the line asked me, "Are you looking for employment?" "Yes, I am. We're not hiring." The line clicked and buzzed as she slammed the receiver down. I was shocked because I had read that they were still hiring people. Then I remembered the cartoonist union that I had visited 7 years earlier and lost touch with. I decided to call it to see if any of the studios were hiring. The secretary said flatly, "Bakshi's hiring." But I had just called them and they said they weren't. They're hiring anybody who can breathe. They're way behind schedule. Who the hell did you talk to? Personnel. You stupid bastard, you never call personnel. Call Jackie Rocher. Here's her number. I thanked her, hung up, and took a moment to think. I was never good on the phone. I would get so nervous that I couldn't catch my breath. So before I called Jackie Rocher, I quickly practiced a big snow job shelling spiel about working for an Oscar-winning animator and being in the Hanna-Barbera training program. Then I dialed her up, and before I could get 2 words out, she said, "Start tomorrow." I guess they really were desperate to hire anyone. I missed Woodstock and Haight-Ashbury and all the defining moments of my generation. While all that was happening in the cultural centers, I was stuck in a logging town in Oregon just reading about it in the library. But working on Bakshi's Lord of the Rings was my Woodstock. Everybody who worked on that project was nuts. Every day was a party. It's a wonder anything got done at all. For a whole generation of new animators, that was our first job in Hollywood. Wes Takahashi went on to run the animation department at Industrial Light and Magic, George Lucas's special effects studio. Eric Daniels, who sat next to me, went on to animate for Don Bluth, and then went to turn to 3D and animated for Disney and DreamWorks. While working on Disney's Tarzan, he invented Deep Canvas, a computer program that allowed background artists to paint in 3D. The route Lord of the Rings took before it landed in Ralph Bakshi's lap was very circuitous. The studio that produced the Beatles' Yellow Submarine announced that its next film would be Lord of the Rings. Then somehow it slipped through that studio's fingers. Stanley Kubrick was pondering doing it at one time, but instead he decided to film Barry Lyndon, another historical epic. John Boorman, who had directed Deliverance, was set to direct Lord of the Rings, but he couldn't figure out how to boil the 3 books down into a 2-hour movie. Disney held the property and passed on it because they couldn't figure out how to stick a cute little bunny rabbit in it. Bakshi, who had become famous directing Fritz the Cat, the first X-rated animated feature, got the contract for Lord of the Rings on the strength of his film Wizards. My first job was in the whiteout department. Ralph Bakshi's Lord of the Rings was shot totally in live action in Spain. Then each frame of the film was blown up to 8 by 10 photograph. Peg strips, cardboard strips with holes punched in them, were taped to the bottom of the photographs so each photo could be registered to the pegs on an animation desk. Animators draw on punched paper that is attached to registration pegs so the paper doesn't slip around. When animators use photographs, they don't want to punch holes in the photograph, so they tape peg strips to the bottom. We in the whiteout department took white paint and painted out everything on the photograph that wasn't supposed to be there. We painted out cameramen, telephone poles, and cars that were parked in the background. Having just hand-painted photocopies on Frank Morris's Coney, I found the technique for Lord of the Rings very similar. From our department, the photos moved to the photocopy department where the photos were copied onto cells, clear plastic sheets with peg holes on the bottom. What was white became clear, so only the orc or the hobbit remained on the cell. Next, they went to the painting department where the artist turned the cells over and painted on the back so as to hide the brush strokes. It's a similar technique to the one sign painters use in painting windows at car dealerships, but on a smaller scale. The result was a film that was essentially hand-painted live action. Occasionally, animators would draw funny cartoons in pencil on the photos, knowing they would be erased and covered with white paint. I remember one such customized photo came across my desk of a battle scene with lots of orcs laying dead on the ground. One orc was laying face down with his arms above his head. The animator had added a drawing so it looked like the orc was shooting marbles. Another animator had drawn a sign that read, "Kick me," on the back of an orc who was standing there holding an axe. Before we erased these cartoons, we photographed them for posterity. About once a week, Ralph would call us into the editing room to see the progress on the movie. As he would finish the animated scenes, he would cut them into the live action. He kept cutting in scenes until all the live action scenes were replaced by animation. I remember crowding into the small editing room one day to see the scene in which Boromir dies. On the screen was the body of Boromir lying in a canoe that was being pushed out into the river in a scene reminiscent of a Viking funeral. Everyone in the film, everyone in the room, was deeply moved. Then the scene suddenly cut to black and white footage of 2 stagehands pulling the canoe across the stage on a skateboard. The first week I was there, I spent every lunch hour circling the neighborhood around the Bakshi studios looking for an apartment. I found one the first week, and since the city of Hollywood had rent control, I kept the apartment for 10 years. It was great having an apartment within walking distance of work. I could save lunch money by going home to eat. We worked furiously on Lord of the Rings. Ralph was in competition with Disney. He was being called the next Disney at the time. Disney, who had passed on Lord of the Rings, was frantically working on the Black Cauldron. Rings and Cauldron were due out in November to catch the holiday rush of moviegoers. As it turned out, the race was no contest. We easily made our premiere on November 28, 1978. Coincidentally, the day my divorce ended. It was final. The Black Cauldron would not be released until 1985. It went through 3 directors. First, Don Bluth worked on Cauldron for a couple of years and then quit to start his own studio, taking all of Disney animators with him. Disney had to shut the picture down and wait for CalArts to graduate enough animators to continue it. The next director, Phil Mendez, worked a couple of years until he also quit to start his own studio and took of all Disney animators with him. Again, the movie shut down until CalArts could supply Disney with more animators. Then Richard Rich inherited the project, vainly trying to stitch together the wildly diverse styles of Bluth and Mendez. I worked at Bakshi for 3 months until the picture was finished. After a month, I was required to join Motion Picture Screen Cartoonists Union Local 839. By getting my union card, I could work in all the big Hollywood cartoon studios. After working for Bakshi, it was a shock to find that working in other cartoon studios was not a party every day. This was most apparent when I went to work for Hanna-Barbera. More about working for Hanna-Barbera next time.